Hello, my name is Lance Tahmahkera. I'm a descendant of Quanah Parker and Cynthia Ann Parker, and I'd, I'd like to visit with you today about uh, their stories and the Comanche stories that have been passed down through the family to me. I'm asked quite often to give these type talks, and it's just a lot of fun. So let's get going here. Uh, Numunuu, that's what we call ourselves. Just simply means the people here, and we've got to start somewhere. So let's go back to 1836, 185 years ago. Uh, Actually, today is March 6th, and it is the last day of the siege at the Alamo, 185 years ago. The next month, you've got San Jacinto. Texas won its independence from Mexico. The very next month, we're talking about Fort Parker now. These these three great events that happened, the raid on Fort Parker, San Jacinto, the Alamo, that all happened within about 200 miles of each other. But let's start focusing on Fort Parker and the Cynthia Ann story. The fort was actually built in 1834. The Parkers had moved down from Illinois with the purpose of simply preaching Christianity to the local tribes. It was a good story, good ideal. But they built this fort beyond the frontier line of U.S. cavalry force that ran basically north to south, and they built it into Indian territory. So in March 1836, some 300 Comanches, Kiowas um, showed up there with the intentions of raiding that fort, taking what they could. And that day, there were 5 people killed at the fort. There were 5 captives taken, Cynthia being one of them. Uh, Miss Miss Kellogg, Miss Plummer, Miss Plummer's son James, uh, Cynthia Ann. She was 9 years old at the time. Her little brother John, he was 6. They were all taken. The women, when we captured these women, we could literally barter them back, trade them for whatever goods we could. And if I get them right, Miss Kellogg was ransomed back within a couple of months, and actually Sam Houston helped pay for that ransom. Miss Plumber stayed with the Comanches for another 2 years before she was ransomed back. Uh, but Cynthia and the children, the reason we took children was simply because people at that age, they died at an early age. And you took the children simply to raise them as Comanches. Uh, and that's what happened to Cynthia Ann. Uh, Her little brother John, James Plummer, I believe they might have been ransomed back maybe in 9 years, 7 to 9 years. But Cynthia Ann, she stayed with the Comanches some 24 years. Um, she became the wife of Pettit Nakota. He was the leader of the Nakotis. And this next slide that I'm showing you, we're going to stop here just real quick. I want to introduce somebody to you. Her name's Anna Tahmahkera. She's my father's aunt, Anna. Uh, she turned 103 this last month, or in January. And she's sharp as a tack. And for years and years and years, I would drive to Oklahoma. I'd sit in her kitchen, and she would just tell me stories uh, of the tribes when we were free out on the plains. The significance of her is that her mother passed when she was a little girl, and one of Quanah Parker's wives, Tope, took her in and raised her. She's actually holding the picture of my great grandfather, Tahmahkera. Tahmahkera was his name, but when we became U.S. citizens, it was changed to Tahmahkera. So she has a real insight here, and the lady on the left, that's Tope, one of Quanah's wives. Another one of his wives there on the right. Let's move forward here. 1860, 24 years she's been with the Comanches. December morning, the men, they're off hunting. And the women, the elders, were still at the tribe. Sol Ross, Texas Rangers, and U.S. Cavalry, they attacked their camp and basically raided it, and Cynthia was recaptured. Suppose she was brought back to Fort Worth, and then she was reunited with her uncle Isaac Parker, who took her in, kept her for a while, and she ended up in Van Zant County in East Texas. But that morning, whenever she was recaptured, Sol Ross, she had a robe around her. The story goes that she had this robe, and Sol Ross took it as a trophy. And a few years back, a co-worker friend, his wife was a director there at the Fort Worth Museum of History and Science. They had that robe there. It was not on display. It was at a warehouse down on Montgomery Street. And we were invited back, a small group of us were invited to this warehouse to see this. This was the robe that supposedly she was wearing that day. And I don't know if that is really her robe. I know that Sol Ross had this robe, claimed it was hers. He donated it to another family. They donated it to another family, and that family in '74 donated it to the museum. But you just have to wonder. In the picture, the far left gentleman, Tom Saunders is his name. He's a Parker County, or was a Parker County rancher. One of the directors of the museum there next to me, and my sister there to the far right. Have no idea what that polar bear is trying to tell her, but he's pretty adamant about it. But the robe itself, it's a beautiful robe. And you just have to wonder, did Cynthia Ann paint that? Did Nakona paint that? What's the symbolism that goes along with it? I don't know, but it's in a warehouse there off Montgomery Street in Fort Worth. And speaking of the buffalo, I want to share a story with you. Understand that back in those days, there weren't schools to teach the children. A way of teaching our young was simply storytelling. And my father's uncle Benjamin, he told me a story. We'd go visit family in Oklahoma, and he'd always find time to take me out on the porch, sit me on his knee, and he'd tell me these children's stories. And the one he told me that day was about the buffalo. This slide of the buffalo. Let's talk about the buffalo. When I was a child, we would go visit family in Oklahoma, and my father's uncle Benjamin Tahmahkera, he only spoke Comanche, and he would always find time during that day to take me out on the front porch, and he'd sit me on his knee and he would tell me a children's story. It was a way of teaching the young. And the story about the buffalo, if you notice, he's got this hump on his back. And Benjamin told me, he said, when the Great Spirit, he put all the animals out on the plains, he put the birds in the sky, he put the fish in the waters, he realized he needed a caretaker, somebody that would look over all his creatures there on the plains. And the buffalo, at the time, his head, it didn't have that hump. His head was way up in the air. He was strong, he was mighty, he was fast. He was the dominant animal out on the plains. And the Great Spirit said, Buffalo, I want you to care for all the other animals and keep the peace. And the buffalo said, okay, I can do that. I'll do that. And for a long time, there was peace on the plains. Things were just like they should be. But as time went on, the buffalo got to thinking, I'm stronger, I'm mightier, I'm faster. I must be superior to the other creatures. And more time goes on, his heart, it just keeps getting a little harder. And he gets angry and he gets hostile. And he thinks, I'm the strongest, I'm the fastest, I'm the mightiest of all the creatures. These are my plains and I don't want any other animals on it. So he started to run the animals off the plains. And it finally came down to an afternoon. He's walking across a meadow and he looks up there on that ridge and he sees a coyote. And he thinks that coyote's got to go. He's on my plains. So with all his strength and might and speed, he charged after that coyote. But as he's running through the meadow, he runs under a tree and he did not see the little bird's nest that had fallen from the limbs was laying on the ground, and he trampled this nest. The Great Spirit couldn't take it anymore. He came down and said, Buffalo, what have you done? I made you the strongest, the mightiest, the fastest of all my creatures. And all I did was ask you to be a caretaker for others. He said, today you attacked one of my creatures and you trampled others. Because of that, I'm putting this hump on your back. Your head will be lowered to the ground, and you'll walk your days looking for those birds' nests. So that's how the buffalo got the hump on his back. Now, understand, this is a children's story that my Uncle Benjamin is telling me. And it's just a simple moral that we're put on this earth to care for each other. Don't think of yourself as superior to others. You know, we're just here to care for each other. It's a good story. He told me several of these stories. But getting back to the buffalo itself, the herds, this is a map done by William Hornaday. He was with the Bronx Zoo in New York. And he tasked himself with bringing a herd of buffalo or bringing buffaloes to the zoo for an exhibit. He realized by that time that the buffalo had nearly gone extinct. But he did find some on a second trip, brought them back. And this is a map of what he did, of the timeline, basically. The red line would be at the height, there were maybe 30 or 45 million buffalo in North America. By the turn of the century, 1900, if you look at those tiny little circles with numbers in there, that's the number of buffalo that were left out on the plains. They nearly went extinct. And if you want to know why the plains tribes, we surrendered and went to the reservations, we were starving. That buffalo is what we needed to survive on. So let's skip forward to 1867. They're in southern Kansas. There's some 24 tribes, Kiowas, Comanches, Apaches, just various tribes. And the purpose was simply that we would surrender and go live on the reservations. And the Medicine Lodge area, it was 3 different treaties signed over about a 7-day period. And we agreed to go live on this 3 million acre Kiowa, Comanche, Apache reservation. 3 million acres there in Oklahoma. The terms of that treaty was simply that we would stop raiding the settlers. We'd go live in this area, and we would allow a railroad to be built across the reservation so that they could transport cattle and people. In return, the buffalo hunters were not allowed into this area to hunt. They would provide us annuities. They would provide us clothing. They'd give the children clothing once a year. They'd build us a hospital, they'd schools. And we went and lived there. But there was one band, the Quahatas, and Quanah was part of that band. They didn't surrender. They didn't sign that treaty. And the significance of Quanah on the plains was that he was able to keep us out there for another 8 years as warriors and hunters. This picture here, this slide here, you see Quanah wearing that war bonnet. That's same war bonnet that's in that case. He's got a lance in his hand. I don't think it's the same lance that's in the showcase. But about 3 years ago, the Panhandle Plains Museum, there south of Amarillo, They had an exhibit opening, and we were invited down there for that. And the gentleman that standing next to me, we were there that day, that evening, and just out of nowhere, we're standing here just after this photo was taken. He starts telling me one of his family stories about Quanah. And it's about when Colonel Mackenzie had been tasked with going and finding the Quanahs and forcing them to uh, surrender and go to the Comanche, Kiowa, Apache reservation. And the story goes that if you've ever been out there to the Panhandle area, the Mackenzie was maybe 2 miles away from the Quanahs, which they were fleeing from him, and they could see each other in the distance. And Mackenzie knew that if he could catch the Quanahs, he could engage them, he could force them onto the reservation. This was going to be the day. And Quanah, the whole tribe, on the move, he had Indian scouts that would linger back and harass the troops and try to slow them down, etc. They'd give reports of how close they're getting, etc. And finally, Quanah said, "Go find the medicine man." And they went and found the medicine man, and he came up and he says, "What, Quanah, what do you want?" And Quanah said, "They're almost on us." And the medicine man said, "Well, what do you want me to do about it?" And he says, "Fix it." And the medicine man stopped right where he was at. And he took out a pipe. He took out his tobacco. He smoked, was praying, singing, and all of a sudden it started to snow. And it became a blizzard to where they couldn't see each other. And the Quanahs were able to escape that day. So this is the story that Don Parker shared with me there in front of that showcase. And standing next to us was a gentleman named Ty Creedler from the University of Texas Tech. And he just had this look on his face. He couldn't believe it. And he said, "I know the other part of that story. You see, there's a Captain Robert Carter that wrote a book on the border with Randall Mackenzie that talked about that day. And their side was that they knew that if they could catch Quanah, they could engage him and they would defeat him. But all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it started snowing. It was late in the afternoon, and the blizzard came up. Their rations were short. Their ponies were tired. They broke off the engagement, and Quanah got away that day. That's the first time I've ever heard two sides of the same story told from the Indian and the cavalry side. It was a neat afternoon. The next day, we were asked to go to Caprock State Park. They're about 50, 60 miles southeast. And there's a herd of buffalo there that Charles Goodnight, 4-6 Ranch, Quanah and him were friends. And Quanah had asked him to help save the buffalo, which Goodnight did. That herd's still up there, and they're at the Caprock State Park. And we were asked to go that day simply to offer a blessing, a cedar ceremony, which we did. And the park ranger told us before we caravanned out there to the park, he said, "All the buffalo are on the north end of the park. You're not going to see any today. But we're still going to do the ceremony." So we caravan our cars out there. In the parking lot where we pulled up, there was actually 3 buffalo waiting on us. We get out of our car, and Don Parker, he's got his back to us here. You can't see it, but he's got a little drum in his hand. He's got a drumstick. And he starts singing 2 songs to this buffalo. And they're literally face to face, maybe 50, 60 feet apart. And when he finished that second song, that buffalo did a 180, spun around, and ran off in the opposite direction. And everybody, I mean, if there was maybe 60, 70 people, in this little caravan, thought That's pretty neat, to see that buffalo that like we were told we weren't going to. And as they're walking to the site where we're going to do the ceremony, it's just me and Don. I said, Don, what songs did you sing to that buffalo? He said the first song was a heights song, heights meaning friend. He said, but my second song, I told that buffalo, I know he's sick. I know he's going to die. He needs to go to the place where he's going to die. Those buffalo understand us. They understand our language. It is a pretty special moment. Getting back to Quanah, out there on the plains for the 8 years. This is a picture from Paladura Canyon. Uh, it's south of Amarillo. It's maybe 120 miles long. The widest parts are maybe 20 miles wide. It's about 800 or 900 feet deep. But that's where we spent our winters there. It was out of the wind. There was game down there. There was water. That's where we would be during the winter time. And my uncle Ko, if I ever bring up Randall McKenzie, he always will say, if it weren't for those Cheyenne scouts that ratted us out, McKenzie would still be out there in West Texas looking for us. But this going into the fall of 1874, McKenzie found us down there in the canyon. There were troops from basically three forts. They attacked us down there, and we escaped, but just with our life. We left our teepees, we left our ponies, we left our food. It was all left behind, but at least we escaped. We nearly starved that winter. It was the next summer, 1875, Quanah surrendered, brought our 200 or 300 Quahas onto the Fort Sill Reservation and surrendered. He was a great leader when we were free on the plains. We were warriors, we were hunters. He was a greater leader when he surrendered. He helped us from going extinct ourselves. One of the first things he did was ask about his mother. We're off hunting. We come back. Our camp's been raided. What happened to her? And the government man, he said, Quanah, I don't know, but I know that there's Parkers living in East Texas. I'll write you a letter of introduction, and you can go visit with them, and they'll tell you. He did, and that's where he learned to speak English. He was around them for a period of time, and he understood the name Parker, uh, related to them, so he took the name Quanah Parker. In time, he became a judge. He was appointed a judge there on the reservation. He negotiated leases with the Burke Burnett's and Wagners and the ranchers in West Texas, North Texas, so that they could run cattle on our reservation and run them across the reservation as they headed to Kansas City to be shipped back east. He was a businessman. In time, the government respected him so much, they appointed him as the principal chief of the Kiowa Comanche Apache Reservation. But Quanah was also, he understood that we had to change our life. We were no longer going to hunt the buffalo. We were no longer going to be warriors. Quanah was a supporter of education. This is a picture from Fort Sill Indian School. He's there in the back. You see the teacher. The little boy there in the middle, just right there in the middle with the saddest face, that's my most favorite picture here. This Fort Sill Indian School had opened in 1871. They were Quaker missionaries that came down that started the school. And it opened in 1871. It didn't close until 1988. That's 117 years. It was a success, the Fort Sill Indian Boarding School. And my father went to this school. When he was 6 years old, he had to go. And you didn't just go in the morning and come home. You went and you lived there. And Dad, he was there for 6 months, came home for Christmas, and told his parents he had learned a foreign language called English. Uh, the school itself, it started with maybe 5 or 7 Kiowa Comanche children. Uh, Imagine at that time, if you can't imagine, these little children had no idea what a school was. There was a 2-story building. They were just terrified of it. The dorm was on the 2nd floor, and the missionaries, they allowed the children to sleep in teepees in the yard until they acclimated themselves to it. Uh, the, there was a little girl that was afraid that if she learned to speak English, they would paint her skin white and she'd be a white person. They had no idea. Um, but in time, it became a source of pride for the families and the parents to send their child there, knowing that as their child grew up, they would be able to fend for themselves and live the life of the American way. Try to understand the purpose of these schools. Up to this point, we were warriors, we were hunters, we were nomads that followed the buffalo. The buffalo was gone, and there had to be a change. The government understood that they were not going to teach those older men how to farm. That wasn't going to be in them to learn how to make that change to be a farmer. Uh, but they did understand if we take the children, we can teach them to be Americans. And it was called the Americanization process. This Americanization process, in the mornings, the children, they would go to do the school. They learned how to speak English. They learned how to read, how to write. They learned the school stuff. But in the afternoons, the little boys, they went off to the fields and they learned how to farm, how to take care of animals. They learned carpentry. They learned trades. The little girls, they learned the domestic things, how to cook, how to sew, etc. But they were learning how to be Americans. Uh, on the plains, it was a communal tribe took care of the child. And now we're getting into this separate family thing here. And they were learning how to be Americans. A friend of mine, Jack Davis, he told me that earlier this week, shared with me that he went to the St. Patrick boarding school there in Anadarko, Oklahoma. And one day they took the boys to a bank, and each boy took out a $15 loan. 5 of those dollars they left the bank. 5 of those dollars they went and bought a pig, and they were expected to raise that pig on the $10 that was left. And when the pig was old enough to be sold and slaughtered, they got the money. They went back and paid the feed store. They paid the guy for whatever debt they owed, and then they got to pocket the rest. It was a learning Americanization process that was taught to the children. Um, like I said, the Fort St. Linden School was a success. Not all boarding schools were like that. Um, but thankfully, the Fort St. one was where my dad went. Quanah, he actually sent 3 of his children to Carlisle up in Pennsylvania. Jim Thorpe, that went to school there, the famous athlete. Story about Quanah taking his children up there was that he dropped them off, and of course, this is a long train ride up there, several days, maybe a week. Um, he drops them off, he comes back, and it wasn't no time one of his daughters shows up at the door. And, Quanah's no dummy. And by this time, Quanah had been the judge and the overseer of the tribe, the reservation, etc. He had ranchers or had cowboys that took care of the place. They cooked the food, they took care of the animals, did the upkeep. He went out to the bunkhouse. He was asking him, "How did my daughter get home? She doesn't speak English. She doesn't have anybody. How'd she get home?" And they were all afraid of him. They wouldn't tell him. And finally, one of them said, "Maybe you better go talk to the foreman." So Quanah goes and finds the foreman and asks him. And the foreman says, "Quanah, her and Emmett Cox, they're sweethearts." So at any time, she became Mrs. Cox. Um, Anna told us that story one afternoon there at the Fort Worth Library. But Quanah, he did something that was unique. He took one of his second oldest daughter, one of his oldest daughters, second oldest, and he told her, "You're not going to go to school. I don't want you to speak English. I want you to only keep our Comanche ways. That's going to be your job. That's what I want you to do." Before I leave this page, the little boy there on the right, there in the back, that's Baldwin Parker, Quanah's oldest son. And the girl there in the middle, the one that's going to stay a Comanche, that's going to keep our traditions, well, she's my great-grandmother, Wioti. I remember her as a child. We'd go visit her, and she always had that hairnet on. She was always wearing that polka dot dress. She only spoke Comanche. I never heard her speak a word of English. She was a sweetheart. And just a quick story about her was her house. It had no electricity. If you wanted water, you went out in the yard, you pumped it out of the ground. But for whatever reason, the family decided she needed a telephone. Okay, so they run a line to the house, they put a phone, install a phone there. And one afternoon, one of her sons, Ben, the one that put me on his knee, put me on his knee and would tell me those stories, he calls her. And she answers, they're talking at Comanche, and she answers, "Hello." He says, "It's me, Ben." And she says, "Well, what do you want?" He said, "My dog, have you seen my dog? He raised hunting dogs." And she says, "Well, yeah, he's right out there on the porch laying down." And he said, "Well, call him to the phone." So she goes out, opens the door, brings the dog in there, holds the phone down to the dog's ear, and he yells out in Comanche, "Kima Sadi," which means "come, dog." The dog hopped up, ran out the door, and ran home. Even our dogs talk Comanche. I've got other stories about her. She's a sweetheart. Quanah, he was friends with Teddy Roosevelt. This slide here, you can see Teddy Roosevelt there more towards the right. Quanah's kneeling there more in the middle. The picture is of Jack Abernathy. And the story about Jack was that he would go out on the plains, he would wrap his arm in a heavy leather and provoke a wolf or coyote to attack him. And when it bit his arm, he would grab it, wrestle it to the ground, and capture it alive, and then sell them to the zoos back east. Teddy Roosevelt heard about this. He had to go see it, and this is from the wolf hunt in 1905. Those ranchers, they respected Quanah so much. He told them one day, he says, "I've got all these wives, I have all these children. I want y'all to build me a house." So they paid for those ranchers, they paid for all the lumber to this the Star House. And if you don't know the story about it, you see those stars on the roof. Quanah was around military people quite often. He made several trips to Fort Worth, to Washington. He was in Teddy Roosevelt's inaugural parade, Fort Sill. He knew that the more stars you had on your shoulder, the more important you were. So he went home and had all these stars painted on his roof. The picture we're looking at now on the far right-hand side, that little smokestack, that's where the kitchen was. And There, just to the left, the second store, that's where the dining room was, and then the upstairs being living quarters, and downstairs a living room and more living quarters. This next slide, this is a picture within the dining room. Quanah's there at the end of the table. And the reason I'm showing this picture to you is that there's a story out there that as the reservation was being broken up, etc., they were allotting 160 acres to each tribal member. And a government agent approached Quanah and said, you know, Quanah, you've got all these wives. At one time, he had 7 wives, maybe not all at the same time, but he had multiple wives. And he said, Quanah, we're in America now. You can't have all these wives. And the lighthearted story is that Quanah thought about it for a second. He says, okay, well, you pick the one that gets to stay and you go tell the others they got to go. But there's more to that story. You see, it angered Quanah when the guy told him that. He said, these wives, I took them in because their husbands have died. I took these children in. If I send them away, there'll be nobody that can take care of them. And the reason I'm showing you this slide here is that Tope told Anna one day that that conversation did happen. And he was upset. Tope said that he called all the wives into this room. And he told them, if there's any of you that aren't happy living here under this roof, come to me, we'll talk, and I'll decide if you can go or not. But he was caring for these people. Quanah, he never stopped being the good son. He always wanted to bring Cynthia Ann back to Oklahoma. He always wanted to bring Cynthia Ann back. He knew she was buried there in East Texas. And finally, in 1910, he was able to exhume her there and rebury her at Post Oak Cemetery in Oklahoma. Picture taken that day. Quanah, he himself, he passed 2 months later. He was buried next to her there at Post Oak. And even 20 years later, 1930, he was still so well thought of that Congress appropriated funds to build him a monument. And this picture was taken there at the unveiling that day. If you remember Baldwin Parker, the oldest son, he's on the front row to the far right. And I've given these talks for so many years, and I had a friend, David Cady, that saw it, and he came to me and he says, you don't have any pictures of your dad. And I said, okay, well, I'll throw a slide in there with a picture of my dad. So that little guy in the white shirt standing up at the front, that's my dad. That picture was taken in 1930. In 1957, Quanah and Cynthia Ann were moved to Fort Sill, the cemetery there, Chief's Knoll. And all the chiefs that signed the treaty at Medicine Lodge are buried there, and their bodies were moved. But this first slide, this is Cynthia Ann, and then this would be her headstone there. I gave a talk in Denton at the courthouse, and a lady after I spoke came up to me with these pictures, and she allowed me to show these pictures to others. But just out of nowhere, I mean, nobody's ever seen these before. Then the two side by side, you can see Quanah under the flag, the monument there in the background. At a recent family reunion, I showed these to everybody, and they were naming off all these people. James Cox, I believe the gentleman to the left with his back to us, that's James Cox. I believe he's our first tribal chairman. Let's talk about the Comanche code talkers. I had an opportunity several years ago at the Comanche homecoming powwow there in Walters, Oklahoma. to sit under those big cottonwood trees one afternoon, me and my dad, just a small group of us. And the gentleman that was there with us was Charles Chibitty. He was the last surviving code talker. And a little story about the code talkers was that in 1940, before America went to war, we knew we were going to go to war, and there in the Lawton newspaper, an ad was placed. It is simply that they were looking for Comanche males that were single that could speak the Comanche language. What they were going to do, what their intentions were simply convert them to code talkers. And the Navajo code talkers, they were recruited, I believe, in 1942 after the war started. But this is even before the war for us. There were 21 that enlisted. 17 actually went to war. Charles Chibitty, I believe in this picture, the war dancer on the right, that's Charles Chibitty. But that afternoon there at the powwow in Walters, he just shared stories about their experiences. And one of them was that when they recruited the people in the paper, there was a group of them that went and enlisted. And they enlisted for different reasons. One of them saw it as a job. The other one saw it because I'm friends with my buddy that's going to enlist. Well, I'm going to go with him. And for some, maybe it was they wanted to be a warrior again. But they all had different reasons for enlisting. But one of the first stories was that when they showed up, there was a small group of them that showed up there to take their physical. And everybody passed except one. He was too small. And he didn't weigh enough. So they said, well, we'll take you, but the little guy we can't take. Well, these other guys, they said, you don't understand. If he doesn't go, we don't go. So they get in an argument there with that private. Officer comes out of his office there and he's wanting to know what's going on. And the private says, sir, these passed their physical. The little guy, he's too small. Doesn't weigh enough. So the officer gives it a thought and he says, okay, this is a Friday. Y'all go home and you, the little guy, all weekend long, I want you to drink water and I want you to eat bananas. So that's what he does all weekend long. He eats bananas and drinks water. Comes back. He still didn't make weight. And we're back into this argument. And the officer comes back out of his office and he says, what's going on? And they tell him. He says, okay, points at the little guy and he says, get back on those scales. He said, private, weigh him again. And the privates weighed him and all of a sudden he made weight. And the private looked down and there's the officer's foot on the scales. And so he made weight. The officer, when they were going to Fort Benning for basic training, he told that little one, he gave them all their paperwork. He says, they think so highly of you. You're the one in charge to get them there. So these code talkers, at that time, basic training lasted maybe 5 or 6 weeks. The code talkers, they did it in 2. Reason being, the very first morning, the DI, he's going to flip on the switches at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. When he did, they were all standing there by their bunk. They were dressed. Their beds were made. They were at attention. You see, they did that every day at the Fort St. Leonard boarding school. They already knew how to march. They knew how to shoot guns. They knew everything about being in the military because that was their life growing up. Charles shared with us that when they went to basic training, they told their DI they didn't know how to swim. And he says, okay, we'll go down this road, take a left. The swimming pool's down there, find the instructor, and he'll teach you how to swim. So off they go. And they never came back. And so that afternoon, he's wondering, where are they? He goes down there, and they're diving off the board and swimming and lollygagging. They just wanted to go swimming. Uh, they just wanted to have some fun. Charles said that they were at D-Day, uh, Utah Beach, and the first message from the beach to the ships was in Comanche, and it was basically that we're 5 miles from where we're supposed to have landed. We're taking heavy artillery. We need help. And the reply back in Comanche from the ship to shore was simply, "We know where you're at. Now get going." Uh, they were actually with Patton during the Battle of the Bulge. They're special. Our military guys are special. Um, something that Jack Davis also shared with me was a little bit about our military people and why they're so important. Um, he said you never approach a veteran from behind. You never touch them on the shoulder. Uh, you never stand so close to a veteran that your shadow falls on them. Uh, they should never have to look over their shoulder. Um, they've earned that right. We really respect our veterans. Okay, let's talk a little bit about eagles here. The significance to the tribes. The way it was explained to me was simply that the eagle is the one creature that flies closest to our heavens. It's that simple. So he must, or they must be the closest with our Creator. We use their feathers in our regalia, um, cedar ceremonies. We use the feathers to push the smoke up to the heavens. The smoke carries our prayers. Um, eagles are special to us. My uncle, he spoke about the feather itself to the Comanches in that the center stem is made up by two veins on either side. And each one of these strands, these are called barbs. And it's the barbs that make up the vein that make up our lifetime. The barbs are all the experiences in our life, the things that happen that that make up who we are as individuals. For the Comanche people, the Indian way is simply that you don't collect feathers yourself, you earn them. If I was brave in battle, if I had done something that was brought honor to my family, to my tribe, I was given an eagle feather. Uh, it's that simple. This next slide, I showed you that one of my dad when he was maybe 3 years old. This is my dad, not too long, close to when he passed, uh, in his full regalia there. And this last story, it's a Comanche story for Comanches. And it's the story of the old man and the Cutsina, the coyote. You see, this man here, he was born at a time when the Comanches, we still roamed the plains. We were hunters, we were warriors, we were free out there on the plains hunting those buffalo. But through his years, he had seen his tribe transition onto the reservation, which only lasted for 30 years. And when the reservations were broken up, and each person was allotted their 160 acres, he was in the twilight of his years, living out his days on his allotted land. But he missed those days of being free out there, of the youth. And he thought, one last time before I pass, I'm going to go live like the Comanches used to do. So he went out into the Wichita Mountains and just by himself. And that evening came, he built himself a little fire. It was a perfect evening. The stars were out. It was a calm evening. And he's just enjoying being out there and being free. But in the darkness, he heard something. And he called out, Madaway, which is yes, hello. He said, who's out there? And out of the darkness stepped into the campfire light a coyote, a cutsita. And in this cutsita's mouth is a gahoo, a mouse. And the coyote, his eyes are like saucers. And he drops the gahoo on the ground and he replies back to the old man in Comanche. He says, Toko, grandfather, it's me, Cutsita. Well, now the old man's surprised and he says, you speak the Numunuu tongue? And the coyote says, yes, all the plains animals speak the Numunuu tongue. But there's no more Numunuu out here. We never hear it spoken again. So the coyote sat down with the old man there by the fire, and they just reminisced that evening, talking about the old stories and things that have long passed. And it was such an enjoyable evening. But finally that Cutsito says, Toko, I've got to go. When you called out to me, I dropped my dinner and I'm still hungry. So they say their goodbyes and the coyote trots off into the darkness. And by now the fire's nearly out, it's just coals. He's tired and he knows it's time for him to sleep. So as he lays back and puts his head on the ground, he hears this tiny little voice call out to him. And it says, Toko, Buddha. He says, grandfather, thank you. And he opens his eyes just in the nick of the time to see a little gahoo tail slip off into the darkness. It's a Comanche story to remind us, don't forget our past. It's important. Thank y'all for allowing me to come visit with you today and share my stories.